It's been 2 years since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. For a while, it seemed as if Ukraine had the upper hand in its war to remain free, but now Russia is on the offensive again. The Ukrainians are outmanned and outgunned, and Republicans in the House are in no rush to help. Next.
This is Washington Week with The Atlantic. Corporate funding provided by Consumer Cellular. Additional funding is provided by Koo and Patricia Ewan through the Ewan Foundation, committed to bridging cultural differences in our communities. Sandra and Carl DeLay Magnuson, Rose Herschel and Andy Shreves, Robert and Susan Rosenbaum, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you. Once again from Washington, Editor-in-Chief of The Atlantic and moderator, Jeffrey Goldberg.
Good evening and welcome to Washington Week. We're going to focus tonight on Ukraine, its struggle against Russia, its central place in the global struggle between democracies and autocracies, its battlefield difficulties, and its worry that President Trump, should he return to office, will abandon it to Vladimir Putin. Joining me tonight in conversation are three great experts on the subject. Ann Applebaum, my colleague and a staff writer at The Atlantic, David Ignatius, a foreign affairs columnist for The Washington Post, and Lara Seligman covers the Pentagon for Politico. Thank you all for joining me. Big topic, second anniversary, and things have changed somewhat dramatically in our perception of what's happening on the ground in Ukraine. David, let me start with you, but I want all of you to answer this very simple question. Is Russia winning?
So Russia certainly has the momentum after last weekend's Iranian evacuation of their position at Avdiivka in eastern Ukraine. There's a sense that the Russians are on a roll. Putin's arrogance in the killing of Navalny reinforces this sense that it's Russia's time. I have to remind myself, thinking back 2 years, to what Russia expected. They thought they'd roll through Ukraine, take Kyiv in 10 days. Measure it against that, you can't say that Russia's winning. I mean, Russia's basically stuck. It's gained 4 provinces of Ukraine, but has not achieved anything like what Putin's aims were. And it has united NATO. There are 2 new NATO members, Sweden and Finland. Russia has bigger problems. So yes, they have the momentum now, but I don't feel as if this is a story about Putin winning. It's a story about Putin having gained more than he had last year.
Ann?
You know, you have to look at, there's really more than one war going on here, right? So there's the war on the ground, and David is right, the Russians made some gains recently, although not all across the country, not all across the front line, just in one particular place. But there's another war they're fighting, which is a psychological war. They're hoping to win the war by dividing us, by dividing Europeans, by breaking up the NATO alliance, by preventing Ukraine from getting more weapons. And unfortunately, here, they are doing very well. So the fact that we're having this conversation is Russia winning. The fact that we're talking about why is the president not able to carry out his own policy in Ukraine? The fact that a small minority in the House of Representatives can block the majority, when a majority of Americans, a majority of members of Congress want to help Ukraine and want to continue the policy, means that, yes, there is, at some level, Russia is convincing people that the war can't be won. And I think it's very important that we understand that and work on overcoming it.
Right. Russia is very, very good at outlasting its enemies or its adversaries, in part by throwing endless numbers of troops into the meat grinder. Is that their hope, that they're just going to keep going until we get quote unquote tired?
But they're gonna keep throwing people at the front line. But mostly what they're working on is trying to prevent us from helping, trying to prevent us from doing more. Using various psychological games, using whether it's trolling or whether it's proxies here or inside Europe. Their main goal is to stop us, because of course, the West united, the democratic world united, if you include Japan and South Korea and so on, easily defeats Russia in terms of industrial strength and everything else. So they need to convince us that the war can't be won.
Right. Lara, let me ask you this. Let me ask you for your own view, but since you're reporting in the Pentagon every day, I'm also interested in hearing what you understand to be maybe the consensus view, if there is one, among America's military leaders, how Ukraine is doing on the ground.
Well, look, the situation on the battlefield right now is pretty dire for Ukraine. Last year, they had this failed counteroffensive that they talked up, and then it did not succeed. And I think at the time, leaders in the Pentagon thought that Ukraine did not really take their best military advice. They had advised Ukraine to put all their forces, their infantry and the Western equipment that they had sent, the Abrams tanks, Leopard tanks, at one point on the front line and get a breakthrough. Ukraine did not do that. Now, we can't really look back and say, oh, that was a mistake, because it's a 600-mile front line, and they were really pressed along the entire time. There are many, many miles worth of mines and heavily fortified Russian positions, and every time they tried to take a step forward, they would get pushed back. So you could make the argument that mistakes were made. Now, the situation is even more dire, and Ukraine has two problems on the battlefield right now. One is the lack of artillery ammunition, and that's not going to be solved until the U.S. Congress passes the supplemental allowing the Pentagon to send additional aid to Ukraine. The second problem is manpower. Russia has a population 3 times the size of Ukraine's. They can, as Anne said, continue to throw people at the problem. Ukraine can't necessarily do that, and that's part of the reason why you saw they had to leave Advika recently over the weekend. So one of those problems can be solved by the U.S. Congress. The second problem can really only be solved by Ukraine itself, and unfortunately, we are looking at a situation where they may have to expand the draft.
Right. I want to come to that, and I also want to come to David to talk about Ukrainian strategy and Russian strategy. But let me just jump to Anne quickly to ask, because it was about a year ago, maybe 11 months ago, we were in Ukraine together the last time, and obviously there was a kind of, if not ebullience, then there was a kind of bullishness in the air in Kyiv and down in Kherson and along that front, that good things were going to happen. How do you analyze what didn't happen? I guess I would say, was it failure of Ukrainian strategy? Was it the lack of munitions and arms? Some combination of the two?
So their argument about the counteroffensive is very different from the Pentagon's argument.
The Ukrainian military commander.
Ukrainian military commander. I saw the defense minister actually in December. They feel that they didn't ever have dominance of the skies. They didn't have the air support they needed. They didn't have quite the quantity of equipment they needed. They didn't have a long enough training period. And they thought that the U.S. gave them advice that would apply to the U.S. Army, which would have had air dominance and which would have had enough equipment, and it didn't work on the ground in Ukraine. They still have, well, I should say there's 2 strategies for winning the war, more than 2, but one of them, the most important one, is mostly still to do with asymmetric warfare, which you and I also wrote about at the time. The use of drones, the use of electronic warfare. The best example of that is their use of sea drones, which are these little cool boats. They're like these little black, they look like paddle boats that have been painted black and have
driverless driverless boats. Yeah,
they're driverless boats, and they have all this cool equipment on them. I've seen them. I've seen where they're manufactured.
And they've had a lot of success in the Black Sea.
A huge amount of success. So Ukraine has no navy, and yet it has pushed the entire Black Sea fleet out of the western part of the part of Western Crimea.
Right.
And they are now exporting grain. They're not threatened by the Russian Navy anymore, which is kind of incredible.
Right.
I don't think we give enough credit to that, and we don't focus enough on it. And I think their longer-term strategy is not exactly that, but to think along those lines along the entire front line.
Okay. David, you've written very interestingly, not just about Ukrainian strategy, but Russian strategy, because I don't want to speak for you, but for me, somewhat surprising, the Russians are innovating in ways that one doesn't associate with the meat grinder approach.
So that's the thing that worries me looking forward. it was always thought that Putin's advantage would be just keep throwing bodies, the pay the butcher's bill. The Russian dead and wounded are supposed to be, the latest U.S. estimate, 315,000, enormous number. But it turns out that the Russians, after initially really bungling their strategy in the first year, being totally overmatched technologically by Ukraine plus the U.S., have gone into a learning phase where they're experimenting with weapons. They're especially experimenting with drones and electronic warfare, learning, going through cycles of changing their equipment, changing their tactics. They're a learning army now in a way that they haven't been, I think, in decades. That's worrisome. A Russian general at the beginning of February published an analysis of their lessons learned in this war after 2 years. And their lessons learned are that the battlefield is completely different. Tanks are essentially obsolete. Traditional air power is essentially obsolete. The future is unmanned systems and the EW that's either going to block them or allow them to get in. And they're on top of that at a time when I think the U.S. is lagging behind a little bit. So everybody should be concerned about that. Like Ann, I was in Munich last weekend, and I think maybe we had a different takeaway. I heard a lot of anxiety, angst about the possibility that Donald Trump could become president. But I also heard a lot of fight from the Europeans. They see what Putin is doing. They see the advances. They see the way this war is now switching. They're nervous, and they're actually doing something about it. They're providing more weapons. They're upping their own defense spending and planning. So, that's the one positive thing I'd say.
I want you to answer that, but let me throw this into the mix as well. Let's just say that the Europeans are so scared of the possibility of Trump coming back to power that they're going to increase their military spending and increase their manufacturing. Could they, within a year, replace what America does?
So, yes. To be clear, the Europeans have spent more on Ukraine to date than we have. The number is 90 billion euros so far, plus they've just agreed another 50 billion euros. So that's by comparison to our bill right now, which is this $60 billion bill that's sitting in the House.
And 90 billion euros today is roughly, sorry, I don't have my currency
it's like,
calculator. About $100 billion.
It's about, their euro and dollar are not that far apart. So they're spending more than we are. All European countries are upping their defense budget. I think Poland is now at something like 4% of GDP. All the frontline states are at 2%, if not 3%. Right. The problem is there is a gap in time. So Europe will be producing more, and they will be at a higher level of production by the end of this year. But we have to make sure that Ukraine survives between now and the end of the year. Right. And that's what only the U.S. funding can do. And so when you hear panic and anxiety in Europe, it's about that. It's about this missing ammunition for this year. And also, of course, it's about the fact that the Europeans it had not occurred to anybody that the U.S. president could have a policy and he would not be able to carry out that policy because a minority would block him. And that's created an enormous amount of anxiety.
I want to read you all a quote. This is said 2 years ago at the outset of the war. They, meaning the Ukrainians, don't have the necessary equipment that they need to face down a foe like Russia. They're outgunned and outmanned and outmaneuvered, and so they've been asking us for quite some time to enhance our support of them. There's obviously a direct interest that the American people have in doing so. That is, as you see, Mike Johnson, who was then a very obscure backbench congressman, now is the Speaker of the House. Obviously, Lara, something has changed in Mike Johnson's belief system, or because he's clearly the linchpin here. If he made a different set of decisions over the past few weeks, the spigot would be open to a greater degree. Talk about that a little bit. I want all of you to jump in on what's happening in Congress, but also sort of, if you can add to what Ann is talking about, how important right now would be an open spigot for Ukraine?
Really important. And I think what Ann is saying about the European defense industry getting to that point by the end of the year is really crucial, because 2024 is going to be the deciding year for Ukraine. You see they're on the back foot right now. If Russia gains more momentum, they can push through. And you heard Vladimir Putin say the other day they want to move to Odessa. They want Kyiv. So unless the U.S. acts now and continues to fill that gap and gives them more ammunition, I do really worry about the future of Ukraine.
Before we come back to the Republicans, I just want to jump off something you said, David. Could the Russians go to Odessa and Kyiv?
So they could go to Odessa. I keep asking people whether a Russian repeat of their initial battle plan is realistic as possible, and the answer is highly unlikely. They could come south from Belarus as they did before, but the Ukrainians have got a lot of electronic warfare capability, lots of ways to stop the Russians. The thing that worries me the most right now is morale. I mean, after weapons. I mean, Anne's right. The problem in Avdiivka, they were running out of ammunition.
Morale and weapons are connected.
So they kind of go together.
Yeah.
But so an army that doesn't have enough air defense to protect its cities, that doesn't have enough ammo to fight, a fair fight with its adversary, is going to have a morale hit. And if that accelerates, then you can imagine sort of a series of rolling defeats. It's stunning that House Republicans, looking at what we're describing, this war after 2 years, are just kind of sitting on their duffs, not taking action. I'm still stunned by it.
Can you explain it?
So I think there is a kind of retrenchment. America first really means America first to these folks. They out in the country, there are obviously a lot of people who are sick of the wars that they think the elites have pushed on them, and they see.
But there is high level of support for Ukraine in the polls still.
Well, President Biden needs to find a way to tap that and motivate it, because time is running out on this.
And he's tried to as well. He's tried to tie Ukraine funding to the U.S. defense industry and said, however many dollars we're spending on Ukraine is actually coming back in battleground states like Pennsylvania. But it hasn't really worked, which is really interesting to me. It hasn't stuck.
So respectfully, I slightly disagree. I don't think what we're seeing is a wave of isolationism or people saying, we just want to come home and we don't care about democracy. I think we're seeing something much more specific than that. So Donald Trump, for his own reasons, doesn't want money going to Ukraine. And that's been clear since last summer. It wasn't entirely clear to me all along. I thought maybe this stuff about the border, we need to do the border, was real. And then it became clear that that wasn't real. So for months now, he's been putting huge pressure on Republicans not to give money to Ukraine. And I think I have reason to think that it's because he wants Ukraine to be weak, so that when he wins, he thinks he's going to win in January, that he will dictate the terms of peace in a way that suits him personally and suits what he imagines to be good for the American economy. So I actually think it's about that, and it's pretty sinister.
Right. I want to play for you. I want you to listen to President Biden for a second, making a plea for more aid.
House of Representatives must pass the bipartisan national security bill. Brave Ukrainian soldiers and civilians are dying. Russia is taking Ukraine territory for the first time in many months. But here in America, the Speaker gave the House a 2-week vacation. They have to come back and get this done.
So, something that you were talking about, it's not getting through. Why is this not getting through? Why is Joe Biden having such a hard time convincing the American people of something that polls show that they actually theoretically want?
Well, I think it's important to remember that we are in an election year, and we're in an election year not just in the U.S., but many countries. I think there's more than 80 countries around the globe are having elections this year. And I think that in elections, people tend to focus on domestic politics instead of foreign policy. So I think that's important. But I think it also is important to say that if this aid bill, the $95 billion aid package, goes to the floor, lawmakers do have the votes to pass it. It's purely because Mike Johnson refuses to put it on the floor that it's not going anywhere. So I think it does come down to the Speaker and his priorities.
It is kind of a rebuke of the president in a way that ineffective, inexperienced speaker with a tiny majority has bollocksed up
Yeah.
the world's sole remaining superpower's ability to execute a foreign policy.
There are things that he could do even without the passage of this to get Ukraine across what I described this week as the valley of death, this period of low morale, Russian momentum. One thing that Biden could do is to send long-range missiles, they're known as ATACMS 300s, which would have the ability to hit targets like the Kerch Strait Bridge that goes to Crimea. When Zelensky came to Munich and met with the bipartisan congressional delegation, he took out a map. And he laid the map down, and the map showed exactly where these ATACMS could hit, all the targets they could hit. And he basically was appealing to this group, this is what we need now. So that's within Biden's power. It appears the White House isn't going to do that, but it's something that would actually shift the balance, I think, in terms of the morale factor.
Let me ask, in the couple of minutes that we have left, I want to ask all of you, not to be catastrophist necessarily, but what does defeat look like? What would defeat look like? And what does victory from an American national security perspective look like? Ann?
So defeat means the elimination of the U.S. as the security guarantor for Europe. It means that the U.S. is no longer seen as a reliable ally by anybody, by Europe, by Taiwan, by South Korea. It means that not just the Russians, but the Iranians are emboldened, the Chinese are emboldened, all of the North Koreans are emboldened, which has already happened. It means a real transformation in how people view the U.S. in the world, and that would have enormous security as well as economic implications.
David,
Yeah,
what is victory?
So, victory for Ukraine, I define it today, assuming they get the weapons from the U.S. Let's make the positive assumption. Victory this year will be holding the line. They are not going to push the Russians out of the 4 provinces that they've occupied, annexed, this year by anybody's estimation. Maybe next year. If they can hold on this year, if they can hold what they have, push back a little bit, hold their ground, steady up, maybe 2025 is the year when they be. But so for now, to me, victory is Ukraine protecting itself, hunkering down, avoiding terrible loss of civilians, protecting its cities.
Lara, I'm going to have you back because you're going to have to tell me another time what victory looks like. Maybe you're just off the hook, but unfortunately, we have to leave it there for now. It's been a great conversation, and I want to thank our panelists for joining us and sharing their reporting. For more on Donald Trump's candidacy, check out Russell Berman's latest piece on theatlantic.com. I'm Jeffrey Goldberg. Good night from Washington.
Corporate funding for Washington Week with The Atlantic is provided by Consumer Cellular. Additional funding is provided by Koo and Patricia Ewan through the Ewan Foundation, committed to bridging cultural differences in our communities. Sandra and Carl DeLay Magnuson, Rose Herschel and Andy Shreves, Robert and Susan Rosenbaum, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
You're watching PBS.